Floating dip tubes are designed to pull beer from the top of the keg where sediment is least likely to settle. There are a few different floating dip tube designs and I'm trying out 3. Which is best? Let's find out. This episode is sponsored by Delta Brewing Systems. More on them in a bit. Hey, how's it going? My name's Martin Keane. Before we get to the floating dip tube stuff, there's something I wanted to show you. This issue of Brew Your Own magazine. It's the September-October issue, so it's a little bit backdated now. But take a look at this. Check out this guy here. It's me. I've got an article in here. There it is. The Secrets to Freezing Yeast. My first time ever getting published in a brewing magazine. This is really cool. They asked me about my process. And the craziest part of all, after I wrote it, they sent it to Chris White from White Labs to review what I wrote. Like he should care anything about what I say about yeast. Yeah, go check it out. So let's talk dip tubes. And first of all, why bother with a floating dip tube? Well, got a corny keg here. Let's take a look at what a standard dip tube looks like. So these dip tubes reach all the way down to the bottom of the keg, and that's where you're going to be drawing your beer from. Now, unfortunately, as homebrewers, unless you're using mechanical filtration, beer that sits in your keg is probably going to have some sort of sediment or particulate in it. Even if I use finings in my fermenter, which I typically do, I still end up with sediment in my keg when the beer is sat there for weeks at a time. There's always some yeast or some trub or some hop matter if you dry hopped as well. And that means that you're kind of pulling from that all the time. Now, there are a few ways around that. The way I used to do it was I would shorten these tubes. So I just took a Dremel to this, and you can see here that it's just a little bit shorter, and it's going to keep it out of whatever the gunk is on the bottom of my keg. That's all well and good, but actually it broke one of my processes, which is my closed transfer process, where I want to fill up a keg with water and star sand and then drain it all out of this tube so I'm left with nothing but CO2. Well, if you have a shortened tube, you can't get all of that water out. So that was a non-starter for me, which is why I turned to floating dip tubes. So let's talk about the simplest type of floating dip tube, which is this. So basically we have a bit of silicone tubing. We have this float here. This is a ball that's just connected to one end of the tubing. And there's just a gap right here for the beer to enter into the tubing. And all this does is basically this weighs this down into the liquid, but it doesn't weigh it down very much. So this will typically just sit on the surface of the liquid. Now on the other end of your keg, you replace your big long dip tube with this little guy here, this little thing. And you simply connect this into here. And now that long piece of metal that was your dip tube is now this flexible silicone tubing that is always just at the top of your liquid in your keg. So that way you're just going to pull from the top all the sediment that's stuck to the bottom. Well, you don't have to worry about that because the clearest beer is going to be what it uses. But I have had 2 persistent problems with this design. First one's related to installation. This tubing is too thick to go through here into the keg. So you have to do everything inside the keg. I've never found a good way to do this. So put this into the keg. Then I need to kind of delve around in here to connect this to this. I mean, it goes in relatively easy when I can see what I'm doing. But when I can't, it's definitely more of a challenge. The second problem is I don't find that this ball sufficiently weighs down the tube. I will often find that this gets so far down and then it just kind of starts sucking in air because it's got like stuck like this above the water line. Almost every time I have this issue, this is not heavy enough to consistently weigh this down. Maybe this line is just a bit too long. Maybe I'm not shaking the keg properly. I don't know, but it's always been a problem. But option number 2 does address that somewhat. But before we get to that, a quick word on today's sponsor, Delta Brewing Systems. Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on stainless steel brewing gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 litres of wort, comes with a dome lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 2 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favour and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Alright, let me get you floating dip tube number 2. This is it, and the only difference is we have this filter screen that actually sits on the end of the line, and the ball is connected to the filter screen now instead of to the tubing. So this should weigh down the filter screen so it is below the liquid line and not be sucking up so much air. That's one benefit to it. But the other benefit, of course, is it's a filter screen, so it's not going to suck up stuff that we don't necessarily want. Now, I'm thinking a really good use for this is when you've dry hopped, particularly if you've dry hopped in the keg, which I've done a few times, or if you're using this in a fermenter and you've dry hopped in the fermenter. Well, all of that hop particulate, some of that might still be in suspension. Well, this filter will do a good job of stopping a lot of that come in. There are actually a bunch of places where you can put this ball. So you can see here that there are these eyes, these hooks, where we can connect. And I've hooked it here to the bottom one, which I believe weighs this down the most. I found, even with this filter screen and playing around with where I connect the ball, the float here, I still have this problem of this sucking up air sometimes. Not as frequently as without the filter, but it's not 0 times either, and that's pretty annoying. The other problem that isn't addressed by this is you still have on this side, well, you have to stick this inside of the keg, stick your hand in there, and then try to blindly put this top on. It's not easy to do. So yeah, that's still an issue as well. But I think overall, this here, which connects into your silicone tubing, in it goes, and away you go. It's a worthwhile solution. So if you already have a floating dip tube and you're having any sort of issues with it, just go out and get a few of these filters. They work pretty well. All right, option number 3, I've never actually used. So whenever I've talked about my floating dip tube issues with people before, they've told me, go and get one of these. This is the Flotit 2.0 floating dip tube, no beer left behind. And there are a couple of things about this design that in theory, I think are going to be really good. Let's take a look inside. So we've got some silicone line, and you'll notice that this is a bit longer than the ones I was using, but there is one key difference here, and that is the width of this line. So with these other 2 dip tubes, you can see here that the tubing goes on top here. So we slide this over the top. This actually has an indent. So the tubing is the exact same width here as this part. Now, why does that matter? Because it means you can push this straight into the keg. Let me show you. But with this guy, easy peasy, in it goes. The downside to this is therefore a little bit narrower. So you're going to get a slower pour coming out, and you can just adjust your serving pressure to deal with that. So what else do we have in the box? This is quite clever here. So we've got a combination of the float again, which is this part here, and another screen, which is this part here. And just to separate these 2 things, you just squeeze this and then pull it through, like so. Now, the big thing that separates this from the other floating dip tubes that I've used is, well, the screen itself is narrower and a bit longer, and the float is much smaller and it's not a sphere. Why do they design it like this? Well, the idea is that this can sit right on the very bottom of the keg. So if I hook this all up, this just simply slides into the other end of this tubing. Now, when this is hanging in the keg, it can sit very low down. So the idea of this is you should leave less liquid in your keg at the end. You can really access almost all of it. To me, I actually don't really care too much about that feature. What I care about is the fact that I can so easily install it. So again, in this goes. I'm just going to grab it here. And now I have the absolute luxury of being able to see what I'm doing in order to hook these two things together. Have you tried these? Have you tried the Flotits, or have you got any tips for using these more traditional floating dip tubes? If so, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Now, floating dip tubes also have the benefit of being pretty inexpensive, and there's probably a few other inexpensive home brewing gadgets you might want to be using. If you want to learn about some of those, you can watch this video here.